Welcome to a comprehensive video about Anglo-Saxon society and their advancements. I have also made a video about the settlement of England and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, so I hope you also watch that after this. The term Dark Ages is sometimes seen as an insult, but it ain't. It just means a time in history that's in the dark, because there's not many sources from the other side. Though it's called the Dark Ages because of the mystery round it all, these times were far from dull when it came to the mind. The Anglo-Saxons thrived, not just in war, but in thought too, making more progress than many other civilizations across the world. Although these people, especially the Roman Britons, didn't write down much history, they were far from illiterate. One clear example is the many large stone engravings found across Britannia, written in Latin like gravestones. In fact, the Romanized Britons were the only folk in Europe who carried on writing in high-level literary Latin after the fall of Rome. David Howlett, editor of the Latin Medieval Dictionary at Oxford, reckoned this might be because they didn't speak a native Romance language, so there were fewer changes muddling the tongue, and they learned their Latin straight from the book. All of these advancements would take too long to go through, but here's a few prime examples. The Anglo-Saxons were active in both local and international trade networks. Their trading helped spread goods, ideas, and cultural ways. This was shown by the Anastasius platter, a silver dish from the Byzantine Empire in what's now Greece and Turkey. It most likely travelled in stages across the continent before it ended up in Britannia. These trade routes showed that folk on the continent saw a reason to come to England for trade. The making of Anglo-Saxon coins, like the silver and gold pennies, helped keep the economy steady and made trade easier. These coins often showed images of kings and symbols. It might sound small, but at the time in Ireland, slaves were used as currency, and over in Germania, folk traded with cattle. So the penny marked a big step forward, likely taken from the Romans and the Franks. This showed the Anglo-Saxons weren't just fine metal workers, but clever administrators too. Later on they brought in the long cross design, which let them cut coins into halves and quarters when needed, a forerunner to coin denominations. The burial ways of the Anglo-Saxons, like using barrows and burial mounds, showed what they believed about the afterlife, and gave us clues about their social ranks and standing. They had their own clear customs. While burial mounds were common, some of the highborn were laid to rest in grand ship burials, where the ship itself was the grave, packed with all sorts of grave goods. Sutton Hoo is the most well-known of these. Guilds and craft groups helped grow specialist skills and fine workmanship, leading to the making of high-quality goods. The Anglo-Saxons took part in wide-reaching trade networks, linking up with nearby regions, and even trading as far as the Mediterranean. This helped spread both goods and cultural ways. The Anglo-Saxon feudal system was set up in layers, with the king handing out land to nobles, called fengs, in return for their loyalty and military support. Common folk and peasants, known as churls, worked that land, living under the protection of these lords. Fishing and likely long-distance trading were common for the Anglo-Saxons, most likely a tradition passed down from their Angle roots. Unique Anglo-Saxon ships were made during this time. The most common was the Saxon keelboat, though folk call it by all sorts of names. Keelboats were a bit like Viking longships, but shorter, around 50 foot, and had no deck, so the oarsmen had to keep bucketing out water that got in through the wood, waves or rain. Most of their boats were clinker-built, where the edges of the hull planks overlapped. This way of building was also used all across Scandinavia. The Anglo-Saxons kept dogs mainly for hunting and guarding, while other animals like cats and birds were also kept as pets, showing their practical use in everyday life. Parties shown in old illustrations were much like Germanic gatherings, with drink, music and beautiful women. The whole community likely came together to enjoy themselves round a fire, drinking from polished horns and surrounded by decorations made from hunted beasts. These gatherings were also a time for sharing oral tales and stories. At these parties, the Anglo-Saxon lyre played a key part. Instruments like the lyre and harp were a big part of cultural life back then. Music had its place in both everyday gatherings and religious settings. The lyre was often used to help tell stories and pass down oral history, as well as for pure entertainment. The music you hear in the background of this video comes from an Anglo-Saxon lyre. Over time, the lyre evolved into the harp, as the harp proved to be more versatile. Primitive drums were still in use too, usually made from goat skin stretched over a wooden frame. Drums and horns weren't just for music either, they were also used to signal and communicate. Singing and poetry were common forms of entertainment and brought folk together. They drank beer and mostly mead, wine made from honey, instead of wine. Beer was more common than water, since they knew it was safer to drink. Even the children drank beer, though women and children would have had the lighter stuff compared to the men. A good way to understand Anglo-Saxon life were through their calendar. Most of what we know about it came from Bede. The Anglo-Saxons started their day in the evening, so their day began when the sun went down. Their months followed the moon, and there were 12 of them. Same number as the Roman and modern months, but since the Anglo-Saxons went by the moon and the Romans didn't, they didn't quite line up. Now and then, they'd throw in a 13th month to keep the moon month steady with the sun year. There were only 2 seasons, winter and summer, each 6 months long, except on a leap year, when summer would be 7. Winter started on the full moon of Wintermonth, what we'd now call October, and summer started 6 months later, likely on the full moon of Month, what we'd now call April. The first month, Aftera Julia, lined up roughly with our January. It meant after Yule. Julea meant the day the sun turned back round and the days started getting longer. The second month was Solmoaneth. Bede said it meant month of cakes, and that they baked cakes during this time. But the old word sol also meant mud, so some reckon the cakes looked or felt a bit like mud, maybe in colour or texture. Next came Hrethmoaneth. Bede said the Anglo-Saxons made offerings in this month to a goddess called Hretha. Sadly, we don't know anything else about her. Then we come to Yostremoaneth. Bede said the Anglo-Saxons sacrificed to the goddess Yostre in this month. Same as with Hretha, that's all he told us about her. She's better known these days though, and the Christian holiday Easter took its name from her. After that came Threemucamoaneth. That meant the month of 3 milkings. Summer had come by then and the cattle gave more milk, so they had to be milked more often. Bede said they were milked 3 times a day. Now we come to Era Litha. Litha in Old English meant gentle or mild, and it pointed to the calm weather over the seas around this time. Some reckon it also marked the summer solstice, and that's why neo-pagans call their solstice Sabbat Litha today. After that, in leap years, came Thrilitha. In other years, this one got skipped. It meant 3 Lithas. We're not quite sure how the Anglo-Saxons chose when to add it, but it were likely done on a local level. I call this midsummer, since it sits right in the middle of summer, but some neo-pagans call Erelitha midsummer instead. Then came Aftera Litha. This month lined up roughly with July, and it meant after midsummer. Next came Wadmoaneth. It meant month of tares, since they are plentiful then. With summer on its way out, the crops would be nearly ready, and the harvest would be starting, or already in full swing. September lined up with Haligmoneth, which meant holy month. We don't know what holy days or rites they might have had then, or what made the month holy in the first place. Next came Wintermoneth, lining up roughly with October. It meant winter month, since winter kicked off with the full moon of this month, called Winterfilith. Winterfilith was the Anglo-Saxon take on the Norse winter nights. Next came Blotmoaneth, meaning sacrifice month. This were when they called the herds, both to get the numbers down to what they could feed through winter, and as offerings to ask for a mild one. The last month of the year were Era Julia, meaning before Yule. It were during this month that Modronit, or Mother's Night, took place. That were the holy tide when the Anglo-Saxons honoured the mothers, the female ancestral spirits who kept watch over their families. For the holidays, there was Yostre, which was marked by feasts held in her honour, an old observance from Anglo-Saxon times. Folks reckon Yostre brought what we now call spring. Litha, or midsummer, were a time to honour the sun, or maybe a sun goddess, by lighting bonfires to strengthen the sun's rays and help the harvest along. Some reckon stone circles were used during this time too, and folk might have gone out on a hunt. Winterfilith marked the start of winter, though we're not sure how they celebrated it. Modronit, or Yule, known as Mother's Night, was the Anglo-Saxon version of Christmas, held on what we'd now call Christmas Eve. They kept ceremonies going through the night, with ale drinking, animal sacrifice, and feasting. It's also been linked to the Wild Hunt and Woden. This were one of the deep roots of what later became Christmas. It shows how the Anglo-Saxons were deeply tied to the land and spirit. They lived by the rhythms of the sun and moon, marked time by the harvest, and honoured their gods with animal sacrifice and great feasts. Their world was shaped by both soil and spirit, and even now you can see how much of that still lingers. We're still heavily shaped by our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, more than most people realise. Slaves played a big part in early Anglo-Saxon society. They were often the descendants of the conquered British folk. The Anglo-Saxon word for Britain got used the same as the word for slave. However, as the Saxons settled, the most common kind of slave was a penal slave. Someone made a slave as punishment for a crime. The poorest Anglo-Saxons also gave themselves up to slavery in hard times, selling family members or even themselves so their kin could survive. Slaves had limited rights under Anglo-Saxon law, but they did have certain days where they could work like free men and earn their own money. On these days, slaves could sell to whomsoever they please anything of what anyone had given them in God's name. Slaves might not have been mistreated, though they weren't treated well either, but it'd be wrong to assume all the slave owners were cruel folk. Slaves were treated as property and protected like any other owned goods. Though the rights of slaves were few, owning them came with risk. Owners were held legally responsible for whatever their slaves did. So taking on a slave weren't something folk did lightly. Some slaves earned their freedom, and that was a big deal to the Saxons, who held proper ceremonies to mark it. Slaves got less brutal punishments for crimes, so they'd still be able to work after. Slavery was seen as barbaric across the water by the later Franks, who turned away from it long before most of the world. The Saxons built mainly in wood, though a few of their stone churches still stand. Anglo-Saxon houses were wooden huts with roofs thatched in straw. There was only one room where everyone ate, cooked, slept, entertained friends, and even kept some of the farm animals, but these huts likely got added to and improved with each new generation. They were built facing the sun to soak up as much warmth and light as they could. The layout was open and square, not round like the old Britain houses. They'd start with a timber frame, then cover it in wooden planks. Wattle and daub walls were also common, a mix of wet soil, clay, sand, animal muck and straw, all packed round woven sticks. The windows were narrow slits called eye holes. Most huts had no glass. If they had windows at all, they were just small slits to let in a bit of light. The floor was just dirt, usually scattered with rushes pulled from the riverbanks. There'd have been a central fire used for both cooking and heating, and the whole house was often dug into the ground a bit to help keep the warmth in. They may have had looms for making clothes and fabric, along with wooden buckets and clay pots for collecting water, storing food, and dealing with waste. They might have sat on benches. Shields and antlers hung on the walls, and animal skins, and maybe tapestries, lined the inside for warmth and a bit of decoration. Dice and other tabletop games have been found, even buried with people. So it's fair to say, gambling was common and meant a lot to people. The biggest house in an Anglo-Saxon village was the hall, the chief's place. He lived there with his warriors. The hall was long, wide and smoky, with a fire set on a stone in the middle. The smoke drifted out through a hole in the roof. Sometimes the oxen were kept down at one end of the hall. The average Anglo-Saxon settlement looked somewhat like this. First, the houses. They were laid out in loose clusters, not all neat and tidy in rows, but scattered about with open spaces between, like folk just built where suited them best. The bigger houses belonged to the lords or the folks with more standing, bit longer, sturdier, with maybe more room for kin or gatherings. The smaller ones were for regular folk, like farmers or workers, just simple, one-room huts, enough for a family to sleep, cook, and keep out the cold. In the middle of it all, there were usually a big communal hall. That were the heart of the settlement. Folk came together there for feasts, meetings, or to settle disputes. It were bigger than any of the houses, built strong with timber, and it showed who were in charge. Some houses were used by artisans, folk like blacksmiths, potters, or weavers. They'd work out of their homes, so part of the house got turned into a little shop or workshop. You'd see tools out front, maybe goods on display, and folk coming by to trade or buy what they needed. It weren't like big town markets, but trade still went on, right there in the settlement. Some of the communal halls were mead halls too. They served both purposes, place for folk to gather, and where the lord held his feasts. So one building could be where you settled disputes by day, then drank and sang by night. Sometimes folk kept their livestock right in the house with them, especially in the colder months. One end of the house were for the family, other end for the animals, like pigs, chickens, maybe a cow if they had one. It kept the animals safe, and their body heat helped warm the place up. Weren't much for smell, but they were used to it. When weather were better, they kept the livestock out in the fields round the edge of the settlement. There'd be open grazing land, maybe a few rough fences or ditches to keep animals from wandering. Folk had to keep an eye out though. Wolves were still about back then, and someone nicking a sheep weren't unheard of either. Most settlements were built on or near a river. People needed water for cooking and washing, and rivers made travel and trade easier too. You'd often find a shallow spot where they could cross, or a little landing where boats could pull up. Plus, being near water meant better soil for growing crops. The fields were usually just outside the settlement. They worked them daily, ploughing, sowing and harvesting when season came. They grew things like barley, wheat and oats. Some fields were shared by the whole village, split into strips so each family had their bit. You'd see oxen pulling ploughs, and folk out there from first light to sundown. There were often a church nearby, sometimes right in the settlement, sometimes a bit off to one side. Early on it were just a small wooden building, but later some were built from stone, stood out proper against the rest of the timber houses. It were where people went to pray, hear sermons, and mark big moments like births, weddings and funerals. Even in smaller villages the church had a strong presence. Pagans, however, preferred the woods to worship. Rough tracks or dirt roads ran out from the settlement, connecting it to the outside world. They weren't like Roman roads, more like worn paths, shaped by foot traffic, carts and livestock over time. Traders, messengers, even the odd traveller passed through, bringing news or goods from other villages and towns. It kept folk from being too cut off. Most settlements had a well dug near the centre, close to where folk lived. It were the main source of clean water, especially if the river were too far or not safe to drink from. People came with buckets every day, and it were a place where you'd often see folk chatting while they waited their turn. Kept covered too to stop dirt, or worse, getting in. There were usually stables near the edge of the settlement or close to the mead hall if the lord had horses. They were simple wooden structures, just enough to keep the animals sheltered and tied up. Not everyone had horses, mind. Mostly the richer folk, or those who needed them for travel or work. You'd sometimes find pigs or goats kept nearby too, all penned up together. Life in an Anglo-Saxon settlement were hard but steady. They worked from sunup to sundown, tending fields, looking after animals, and mending what needed fixing. Most lived with their families in small smoky houses, eating what they grew or raised. Community mattered. People helped each other out, shared tools, told stories in the mead hall, and gathered for feast days or church. It weren't a life of comfort, but it had rhythm, rooted deep in the land, and in old ways passed down through the years. But how did the gender roles differ? Well, first, let's look at men. Young men were mainly warriors, proving themselves as a force to be reckoned with against the natives of Britannia. But they were skilled farmers too. They were expected to show bravery, leadership and strength, especially in battle. Their place in society often came from how well they fought and the power they held. They were mostly involved in public life, fighting in wars, taking part in running things and dealing with the law. It were their job to protect their communities and to have a say in politics and justice. They held proper positions of power and authority, like kings, nobles and warriors. They had strong legal rights too, could own land, sit on councils, and make choices that shaped their communities. They got stuck into work that kept the economy going, farming, trading and crafting. They also earned respect and status through what they did in battle. Men from wealthy families had better access to education and were more likely to be able to read and write. They were taught about the law, religion, and how to lead others. They enforced the law, making sure rules were followed and justice were carried out in their communities. Men were expected to take just one wife and had a lot of say over family matters. They were seen as the head of the house, and it were their duty to protect their family and their local folk. Men didn't just grow and hunt for food, they prepared and cooked it too, especially the meat. They earned money through work like farm labour, crafting, trading and fighting when needed. They held roles of authority in the church, priests, monks and bishops, running worship and taking care of church matters. Christianity brought in a more male-dominated setup than what you'd see in Anglo-Saxon and Britain pagan ways. Overall, men played a dominant role in public and private life, fighting, leading, working, and making decisions that shaped both family and community. Their status came from strength, land, knowledge, and the roles they held in war, politics, and religion. Next, women. They mostly looked after things at home, running the household, raising the kids, and working with cloth and thread. Their roles stayed close to the home and family life. They generally had fewer legal rights and were often under the protection of their fathers or husbands. Still, they could own land and had some legal safeguards, especially widows. It's likely women held a fair bit of influence, just more behind the scenes. Marriage was usually arranged and women were expected to support their husbands and run the household. They had fewer say in who they married and were meant to be obedient to their husbands. Though no one really knows what went on behind closed doors, some women might have been more dominant there, but that's not likely. They helped keep things going at home by spinning, weaving and brewing. Their work was vital to the household's survival, but it didn't get the same recognition or value as the men's. Education weren't as easy to come by, especially for poorer folk, but noble women and women in the church might have been taught religious and domestic skills. Back then, it were more about how much coin you had than whether you were a man or woman. Women could become nuns or abbesses and take part in religious life, mostly through prayer and charity. Still, they didn't hold much sway in the church, seen more as carers and mothers. In the old Anglo-Saxon and Briton pagan days, women might have had more say in religious matters, but how much is lost to time? Women, on the other hand, baked bread, brewed beer, and made cheese. No matter their rank, women served drinks to men. It showed their place beneath them. Women were expected to be innocent, virtuous, modest, and always supporting their families. Their place in society often came from who they were related to and what they did at home. A good way to see the different views on men and women is through pleas for mercy. The king had to uphold justice and keep a strong image, so showing personal weakness weren't an option. Mercy then had to look like a grand, noble act, not something soft or sentimental. That's why the queen would beg for mercy in public, asking her king to show kindness. This let the king give in out of love for his wife, without making himself look weak. From a modern point of view, the way Anglo-Saxon women were treated might seem cruel or unfair. They had fewer rights, less say in public life, and were often expected to be quiet and obedient. But that's only part of the picture. There's plenty of evidence showing that men loved their women deeply. Wives, daughters, mothers. Some even gave their lives for them. Love back then didn't always look like it does now, but it were strong all the same. A man's honour were often tied to how well he looked after his family, and protecting his wife weren't just expected, it were a matter of pride. In songs, stories, and even wills, men left their most valued things to the women in their lives. They built homes, fought in wars, and faced death, not just for glory, but to keep their loved ones safe. So while women might not have had the loudest voice in public, they held deep meaning in private, and that's a kind of power too. The Anglo-Saxons were skilled farmers and agriculturalists who often kept animals as part of their livelihood. Cooking were usually done over an open fire in a central hearth, with pots used for boiling and spits for roasting meat. Bread were baked in communal ovens or hearths, and common ways of keeping food included smoking, salting, and drying. Most households grew root vegetables needed for stews, such as carrots, which were purple at the time, turnips, parsnips, onions, garlic, and cabbage, though potatoes were not yet available. Meat was rare and considered a treat, with many poorer Anglo-Saxons following a primarily vegetarian diet, sometimes saving meat for the working men of the household. Protein sources for those who couldn't afford meat regularly included peas, beans, and lentils. Stews were a staple meal, often kept on the table continuously, with ingredients being added throughout the week, which resulted in a stock that became richer over time. Utensils used for eating were primarily knives and spoons, as forks were not yet in common use. Bread, porridge, and gruel were everyday foods for all classes. The Anglo-Saxons ate all sorts of meat: pork, beef, lamb, and goat. Pork were especially popular since pigs were easy to raise and full of fat. They often salted or smoked the meat to make it last. Fish were another big part of the diet, especially for folk living near rivers or the coast. They had freshwater fish like trout, eels, and pike, and saltwater ones like herring and cod. Fish mattered even more during fasting times when meat were off the table. Dairy products including milk, cheese, and butter were also significant parts of the diet. Cheese made from cow, sheep, or goat milk could be stored for longer periods. In addition, fruits such as apples, pears, cherries, plums, and berries, including blackberries and raspberries, were consumed fresh in season or dried for winter use. Hazelnuts and acorns were foraged and provided good sources of fat and protein. Culinary herbs like thyme, mint, dill, and sage were commonly grown and used for both flavouring food and medicinal purposes. Imported spices, such as black pepper, were rare and expensive, primarily reserved for the wealthy. Alcoholic drinks, brewed from barley and sometimes flavoured with herbs like heather or sweet gale, was the most common drink, consumed by everyone, including children, as it was safer than water, which was often contaminated. Mead, a fermented drink made from honey, was also popular, especially during feasts and special occasions. While water was consumed, it was viewed with suspicion due to the contamination risk, so milk was more frequently consumed fresh or used in cooking. Feasts were important social events for the Anglo-Saxons, featuring large amounts of meat, bread, ale, and sometimes luxurious foods like honey or imported wine. Religious practices also influenced their diet, particularly during fasting periods when meat was avoided and meals were limited to fish, grains, and vegetables. It's likely that poorer communities would come together for smaller, simpler feasts. The Anglo-Saxons were renowned for their military prowess. They managed to subjugate and take over all the valuable land on a whole new island full of foreign tribes. But even before that, back in Germania, the Romans had never managed to conquer the Germanic tribes. The Saxons especially had run-ins with Rome and survived. We'd now look into some of the reasons the Anglo-Saxons had their edge. Firstly, they had a strong warrior culture that put a lot on loyalty, honour and military skill. They trained from a young age, used well-made weapons like swords, axes and spears, and fought in tight organised tactics that needed discipline and teamwork. They lived hard lives, and their Germanic roots gave them a cultural edge in battle, since much of their way of life centred around it. The Anglo-Saxons were skilled ironworkers. Making iron tools, weapons and everyday bits played a key part in their daily lives and boosted their strength in battle. The Anglo-Saxons grew a real love for swords, going beyond just the ceremonial use you'd see in most other Germanic tribes. These swords were buried with the dead, or sometimes passed down and had many different owners over time. They used simple but effective designs. Basically, the iconic sword you picture in your head is what they had. Owners would change and add to the sword over time, making each one quite unique. Though there were clear styles of swords, most ended up bastardized, mixing styles based on the sword's history and the current owner's preferences. Wealthier folk decorated their swords much more, along with their armour and shields, which were highly ornate, even for the time. It's clear that to the Anglo-Saxons, arms and art went hand in hand. Their weapons were filled with symbolism tied to honour and heritage. These would later morph into what we now call heraldry. Older swords and armour weren't just thrown away either. This again shows how much the Anglo-Saxons valued age, experience and heritage. Their thinking might have been, a new sword or fresh armour might look shiny, but it's untested. Older gear is more dependable. It's proved itself. Much like the earlier Germanic tribes, early Anglo-Saxon swords and arms still had runes and animal shapes crafted into them, meant to embed the weapons with magic and deep symbolism. They were one of the main weapons the Anglo-Saxons used in war, alongside the shield. Pole arms and axes were used too, but they had other jobs, like chopping down trees or hunting. Swords, though, were purely weapons of war and self-defense. If you were rich enough to buy one or lucky enough to inherit one, you'd most likely carry your sword with you most of the time for protection if you were a man. They were also the most prestigious weapon, as shown in the art, literature and archaeology of the time. Every man wanted a sword. Many swords might have even had names, sort of like in Game of Thrones. Seax swords were obviously very common among the Saxons. They were short swords, or more like large knives, that got even shorter once they reached the British Isles. Most likely they were dead useful during a shield wall, where swinging a full-length sword around weren't possible, but one of these could slip through a small gap. The Seax might have also had more practical uses, like hunting, or as a general tool. Many Anglo-Saxons have been found buried with two, so maybe one was for eating and the other for fighting. Spears were also very common, and the main weapon for infantry in war. Even high-status warriors still carried spears. They were the go-to weapon in battle, but folk wouldn't carry them around in daily life, because of their size. They were really only effective when used in a group, so not much good for self-defense on your own. Both large and small axes would have been used. Small ones were likely thrown or used as a poor man's weapon. The larger ones were probably wielded by bigger, stronger men. Axes were handy for hooking round a shield wall and breaking it apart, pulling shields away, or dragging foes in. The Anglo-Saxons often used shields, which they sometimes called lind, after the linden tree they were made from. Linden wood was popular because it was tough but light and easy to shape. Poplar and oak were also used, though poplar was preferred for being lighter. Small round shields were favoured for parrying and blocking, in more of a duelling setting. Convex shields were also common, most likely to help deflect or hook away axes. These curved shields seemed to get more popular in the later Anglo-Saxon period, especially during the Viking Age. Shields normally had a boss in the middle, both for extra protection and for bashing someone with. They were almost certainly painted, though we're not sure exactly how. Most likely with symbolic or heraldic patterns. Metal ornamentation, called fittings, was sometimes added to shields, though it's unclear if that was common or just for the wealthier folk. In Norse holmgang duels, both warriors would take 3 shields, expecting at least 2 to shatter. That shows shields were seen more as temporary tools, not something to be treasured like a sword. That also helps explain why so few Anglo-Saxon shields survive today. Shields were painted with symbols, most likely tied to household identity or spiritual belief. Anglo-Saxon armour typically consisted of chainmail shirts and helmets, giving solid protection in battle. Wealthier warriors had access to better, higher quality gear. They'd have worn animal hides like deerskin underneath the armour to stop it rubbing and cutting into them. The use of horses weren't common, despite Tolkien's creation of Rohan. This were likely a remnant of their German roots, since many of the Germanic tribes didn't use horses or cavalry in battle. Instead, they served more as status symbols. This were backed up by the poem of Beowulf, which described them as ornate battle seats, not proper cavalry. An old Anglo-Saxon maxim also suggested that warriors stood while an earl belonged on horseback. A king is eager for ruling. He hates the one who claims land, loves the one who offers more. Power must go with pride, boldness with sharpness of mind. Both must decide to seek battle. An earl belongs on the back of a horse. A troop must ride in a company. A foot soldier stand fast. A woman belongs at her embroidery. An example of this were the Battle of Maldon, 991 AD, where, afore the clash, the warriors were ordered to loose their horses and shoo them away. This weren't to say horses went unused. Bede, for instance, noted that young Anglo-Saxon lads loved to race on them. They were also definitely used for hunting, farming and getting about. Why would they have done this? The Britons used horses and so did the Romans and Huns, so the Anglo-Saxons would have known by them the power of cavalry. Well, there were two explanations. One, tradition. Maybe it just weren't seen as some of their folk did. Second, it might have been meant to curb cowardice, one of the worst sins for an Anglo-Saxon. Without horses, how could a warrior flee? Instead, he had to stand fast and fight. Although, some evidence suggests certain Germanic and Anglo-Saxon groups fielded mounted warriors in particular situations. For example, the Abelemno stone from about 650 AD showed both the Picts and Anglo-Saxons fighting on horseback. Though it were carved by the Picts, so maybe they just did it to make the scene look more exciting. Even if it were right, we can still say Anglo-Saxons fighting on horseback were less common than the norm. Siege engines were something the Anglo-Saxons lacked. Roman advances in military technology, like ballistas, catapults, and even tactics such as the cavalry charge, didn't seem to survive with the native Britons, and so weren't passed on for the Anglo-Saxons to use. Another vital thing that was lost was the idea of a standing army. Instead, troops were raised from the local population and conscripted into service now and then, usually to fight on campaign for about 3 months at a time. As the Anglo-Saxons grew more peaceful over the generations, their skill in fighting, like their original settlers once had, would have waned. The Norse, still in Scandinavia on the other hand, held on to the thought of battle as a way of life. This shows a big shift in Anglo-Saxon culture from their Germanic roots, but again this didn't happen overnight. By the Middle Anglo-Saxon period they were struggling with Briton raiders, much like the Britons they'd once replaced. Huscarles, or housemen, were the closest thing the Anglo-Saxons had to knights. They were trained warriors who served as bodyguards to kings and nobles. They made up the elite warrior class, professional, highly skilled fighters in Anglo-Saxon society. They were expected to show fierce loyalty to their lord, and were often bound by personal oaths of allegiance. Known for their top-level combat skills, Huscarles were well trained with swords, shields and spears, and played a key role in battles and skirmishes. They weren't all that common at first, but by the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, they became more widespread, and by the time of the Viking invasions, they were commonplace. The term Huscarl itself wasn't really in use during the exact time period we're covering in this video, but the role of a personal bodyguard was still very much there, which is why I'm bringing them up. The Anglo-Saxons built up a formidable navy, which played a key role in both defence and offence. Their shipbuilding skills and naval tactics helped them keep control over coastal areas. Anglo-Saxon shipbuilders were skilled at making seaworthy vessels. Their methods, including the use of clinker-built ships, boosted their strength at sea and added to their overall naval power. Huscarls stood around the king at the centre of the shield wall, acting as his last line of defence. They were the most trusted and best trained warriors, forming a tight circle when needed, ready to die before letting harm come to their lord. Their skill and loyalty meant the heart of the army stayed strong, even when the rest of the line started to crumble. The front line of the shield wall was made up of warriors with interlocking shields, shoulder to shoulder. This wall formed a solid barrier, hard to break through. Fighting was up close and brutal, swords, spears and sayaxes stabbing through gaps, while shields were used to shove and bash. It took strength and nerve to hold the line, especially under pressure, but when held tight, it was near impossible to push through. Reserve troops were likely held back behind the main line to stop any flanking attempts and to reinforce weak spots in the shield wall. They could rush in if the front started to buckle, or swing round to hit the enemy from the sides if the chance came. These men added flexibility to the battle, keeping the shield wall from getting overwhelmed or surrounded. Archers would fire over the shield wall, softening up the enemy before the main clash. They also acted as skirmishers, moving ahead or along the flanks to harass the enemy, pick off key targets, and break their formation before hand-to-hand fighting began. While not always the main focus of Anglo-Saxon warfare, archers played a key role in creating openings and throwing the enemy off balance. Trying to outflank the enemy or force a break through their shield wall was often what finished a battle. These fights were close, bloody, and deeply personal. You'd be standing inches from your mates, and some of them might fall right beside you. Morale played a huge part. One man running could start a collapse, while one holding firm could steady the line. The boar snout formation, where warriors formed a wedge to punch through enemy lines, was used too, though it was less common. Once a shield wall broke, the fight turned into smaller scattered skirmishes. Messy, frantic clashes where the skill and grit decided who walked away. The Anglo-Saxons spoke Old English, a West Germanic tongue that evolved over time and laid the foundation for the English language. Anglo-Saxon was part of the Anglo-Frisian branch of the West Germanic languages. Even today, Frisian, spoken in the northern Netherlands, was the second most similar tongue to English, after Scots, which was also part of the Anglo-Frisian branch. Modern German and Dutch speakers would in fact have found Old English easier to pick up than modern English. At first there were no signs of Briton influence. Yet Latin leaves were clear from the outset, owing to Romanized Celts and the Christian faith. There were no set starting date for Old English. It began shaping itself as early as 450 AD and carried on up to about 700 AD. Originally, Anglo-Saxon runic writing was soon took up and merged with the Latin alphabet, fashioning a new writing system still not fully grasped, now called the Insular script. These were all examples from the same time period, showing the origins of the English language developing. The first text writ fully in Anglo-Saxon were the Cadmun or Junios manuscript from round 741, and it held many Old English poems. Anglo-Saxons first scratched foothawk runes, each mark standing for a sound. The Ruthwell Cross, set up round 680 AD in Dumfries, still bore those runes before Latin letters took over. Scribes penned insular script, part runic in soul and full of Latin curves. The Lindisfarne Gospels, wrought round 700 AD on Holy Island, showed that hand at its finest. Monks penned Latin writing, plain yet grand. The Codex Amutinus, finished round 700 AD, stood as its masterpiece. Some runic could still be seen today in modern English. For example, the Anglo-Saxon rune thorn, the P-looking symbol, meant the, like in the old bakery. However, as the printing press came over to England from Europe, the thorn rune got printed as a Y instead, since thorn was only common in England, not on the continent. Therefore, the old bakery became ye old bakery, but that Y was still meant to be said as the. Anglo-Saxon literature, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and epic poems like Beowulf, showed the richness of the language. Though Beowulf were written down around 1000 AD, it had been told by mouth for many years before. Anglo-Saxon shops, meaning poets or bards, played a key role in society, making up and performing oral poetry, often with a harp in hand. Shops kept history, legends and heroic deeds alive through telling stories, usually as epic poems. They were well respected for their knack to entertain, inspire and pass on the values of their people. Some of the famous works they might have recited include Beowulf and other heroic sagas. A good example of some of these poems are in the Vercelli book, found all the way over in the Italian town of Vercelli. It held a mix of religious prose and poetry, with pieces like The Dream of the Rood and a homily thought to be by Elfric. Another key collection is the Exeter book, put together sometime between 960 and 990. It's packed with all sorts of Old English poetry, including The Wanderer, The Seafarer, and a whole load of clever riddles. I don't enjoy reading myself, but some of these were genuinely good. I recommend you look into them. The Anglo-Saxons were also fond of riddles. Here's one written in Anglo-Saxon on an artifact known as the Frank's casket. The casket were most likely made in Northumbria for a patron over in France. What am I made from? The flood cast up the fish on the mountain cliff. The Terror King became sad where he swam on the shingle. I'll give you a moment, see if you can guess what it is. It's a whale's bone. Did you get it? Until the Norman conquest, the official language of the Anglo-Saxons was Old English, also known as Anglo-Saxon and Anglish. It was a language of high culture, administration, and everyday speech, although Latin was preferred by monks. It was a highly sophisticated language with its own grammar, look, and rules, many of which had been lost to time. It were also incredibly beautiful to look at. The creation of illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels showed the Anglo-Saxon skill in art and how they blended visual beauty with written word. Anglo-Saxon metalwork and jewellery showed off their skill with fine detail, often using gold, silver and gemstones. One of the best-known finds were the Staffordshire hoard. Most famously, there was Sutton Hoo, a massive treasure trove dug up by Basil Brown in 1939. He was a self-taught archaeologist who uncovered a buried ship filled with gold, silver, weapons, and a ceremonial helmet. Though no body were found, folk believe it might have been the grave of a powerful king, like Redwald of East Anglia. Firstly, there were gold belt buckles, gilded shoulder clasps, and an ornate purse, just to name a few. The treasure found in this simple trove could rival any ornate item from any time, from anywhere in the world. It also showed off the finest techniques of gem cutting and metalwork of the period, with deep red garnets set in intricate patterns. The gold belt buckle is a brilliant example of how advanced the literary skill of the Anglo-Saxons were, showing a strong grasp of grammar and iconography. The interwoven animals on it hide about 13 creatures in plain sight: birds, snakes, and four-legged beasts. Reading this belt buckle is like cracking a puzzle, needing to be carefully decoded. Though it's not as developed as a full alphabet, it shows that early Anglo-Saxons, even before writing down Old English, were still literate in their own visual and symbolic way. The most iconic piece, though, is of course the Sutton Hoo helmet, which now stands as a symbol of Britain and the English people. Sutton Hoo bore a striking resemblance to the ship burials at Vendel and Valsgärd, from around 500 to 600 BC, just north of Uppsala in Sweden. Like Sutton Hoo, those graves held richly decorated helmets, weapons, and ornate gear, all buried within ships. The craftsmanship and style, especially the use of animal motifs and interlace patterns, were near identical, suggesting strong cultural ties between early Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavia. This connection hints at shared beliefs, trade, and maybe even common ancestry, showing that the Anglo-Saxons didn't arrive as some isolated tribe, but as part of a much wider northern world. Historians are still baffled by how the Anglo-Saxons managed to craft such tiny, detailed designs visible only to the human eye. This level of skill showed up not just in metal and jewellery, but also in manuscripts. Some of the greatest craftsmen in human history lived in Anglo-Saxon England. Even poorer folk, like peasants, wore simple bronze or everyday brooches and belt buckles, showing that decoration and identity mattered across all classes. The Alfred jewel is another standout example, likely made for King Alfred himself, blending beauty with purpose. The advanced metalworking techniques of the Anglo-Saxons, like filigree and cloisonne, made it possible to create such intricate jewellery and artefacts, unmatched in their time. These carvings are examples of Anglo-Saxon stonework, where pattern, shape and symbol all played a part. The designs often mixed animals, knots and bold lines, though the meaning behind them isn't always clear. They show how stone was used not just for building, but for expression, whether for faith, memory, or something else entirely. Writing was carved straight into the surface. The shapes of the letters stand out sharp, but what they meant back then might have been clear only to a few. It's a reminder that stone wasn't just for pictures, it carried words too, though now we can't always grasp what they were trying to say. These are examples of Anglo-Saxon metalwork, where detail and shape mattered just as much as the shine. Animals and patterns were worked into the design, showing a clear eye for style and story. They weren't just for show, they likely had meaning, though now that meaning's half lost to time. These glass vessels are examples of early craft, made with care and a keen eye for shape. The colours and textures suggest they weren't just everyday items, but something special. They show that even fragile materials like glass were used to make things both useful and striking. The Anglo-Saxons were skilled in textile production, weaving intricate patterns into their clothing. The quality of the fabric and the complexity of the garments often showed a person's status. They made garments of extremely high quality, mixing silk with gold thread. Later English periods took clear inspiration from the craftsmanship of the Anglo-Saxons, especially in their use of fine materials and detailed embroidery. This influence can be seen in works like the Toledo Cope, made in the early 1300s. Rich with gold thread and silk, it reflects the same blend of skill, symbolism, and luxury that Anglo-Saxon textiles were known for centuries earlier. Early versions of board games like backgammon were played, offering both entertainment and strategy. Two of the most popular games were Tafel, which had Germanic roots, and Nine Men's Morris, inherited from Roman influence. Tafel in particular evolved over time, with many different boards and sets of rules found across Britain and beyond. These games weren't just pastimes, they reflected trade, cultural exchange, and the value placed on wit and skill, and were an art form of their very own. Anglo-Saxon architecture, mostly seen in churches and forts, had simple, solid designs made with timber and stone. It showed off narrow windows, tall towers, and fancy carvings. What made Anglo-Saxon architecture stand out was how it mixed proper, useful building with detailed craftsmanship, especially in their churches. These had striking stonework, neat carvings, and early stone towers that shaped later medieval building styles. Anglo-Saxon architecture stood out for its tough, no-nonsense design, mixed with surprising detail. It weren't just churches, they built halls, homes and forts too, all meant to last through harsh weather and rough times. Most buildings were simple in shape, often rectangular, with thick walls made from timber or stone, depending on what was to hand. What made it unique was how much thought went into even the plainest structures. Roofs were steep to let the rain run off quick, and buildings were often raised a bit to keep the damp out. In stonework, you'd spot long and short corners, careful carvings and strip patterns to liven up the walls. It wasn't showy, but it had a quiet pride to it, solid, clever and full of character. They also built defensively with burhs, fortified towns, set out in neat grids with ditches and banks for protection. Everything had purpose, but they still found room for craft, even in door frames or beam ends. That blend of everyday use and thoughtful design is what set Anglo-Saxon building apart. It weren't just thrown up, it was made to stand. The Anglo-Saxons also made huge advancements relating to politics. One example is the Wittenmote, an assembly of nobles and clergy, advised the king and held a huge amount of political power, a step up from the earlier Germanic Hustings. Anglo-Saxon tribes weren't primogeniture, so the firstborn son didn't inherit by default. Instead, the Wittenmote decided after a king's death, and if they were loyal, they'd take into account, or follow, the past king's wishes. This could be seen as a very early form of parliament or privy council. It should be noted that this was not what we'd call the king's court. There was no official name for a king's court or his followers during this time. The Roman historian Tacitus called them a comitatus, a Latin term. In Beowulf they're referred to as a droit, a Germanic word meaning army. A king would have gathered a large group of people around him, including his family, warriors, religious figures, and loyal lords. Together these people made up what we might now call the king's court or inner circle, even if it didn't go by that name back then. Earls were also instated who looked after land in the name of the king. Earl came from the Norse word jarl, meaning leader, or the Anglo-Saxon word uldorman, meaning either the same thing or elderman. They looked after shires and had a great deal of legal authority, as well as military defence of the shire, including mustering the fyrd, the local army. Every fyrd would have been mustered differently, depending on the laws of their local lords. This has sadly been lost to history, but it's likely some fyrd were more professional, while others were just a group of peasants. As time went on, the fyrd probably grew in organisation and professionalism. They collected fines and taxes and acted as royal representatives in times of weak kings. Some shires were grouped together known as earldoms. There was no female equivalent to an earl, though the title countess was later adopted from the continent, as their version of an earl was a count. In very early Anglo-Saxon settlements, every village were loyal only to their own chief or king. Over time, these kings would have owned many villages and lands, too many to manage on their own, so they'd have passed down power to rule in their place, to someone called a reeve. That's where the word sheriff comes from. These kings started to see themselves more like what we think of today as a king, as they were influenced by Romanised culture. They then began using the term rex, Latin for king. At the very top we have the Bretwalda. This was a powerful king who had authority over several other kings, an overlord of sorts. The title wasn't official, but it showed who held the most power across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Below the Bretwalda, we have the kings. Each ruled their own kingdom and had full control over their land, people, and armies. They made laws, collected taxes, and led in battle when needed. Kings could be powerful, but they still answered to the Bretwalda if one was recognised at the time. Below the king we have the Wittenmote, the council of nobles and churchmen who advised the king. They didn't rule, but their support were important, especially when choosing a new king or making big decisions. The king were expected to listen to their wisdom, even if he didn't always follow it. Below that we have the high-ranking nobles and church leaders. Earls were powerful landowners who ruled large areas for the king and helped keep order. In earlier times these nobles were called Jesif, but by the 8th century the word earl took over. Later, by the 10th century, thane became more common, sometimes used for earls with smaller lands or lower status. Archbishops and bishops were important church leaders. They controlled church land, advised kings, and were part of the Wittenmote. Their power wasn't just religious, it were political too. Below the earls and bishops we have the halfords and reeves. A halford, what we'd now call a lord, were in charge of a smaller area of land and the people living on it. They looked after justice, collected rent, and made sure their land stayed productive. Reeves worked under them, managing day-to-day tasks like organising workers, keeping law and order, and making sure taxes and goods were sent up the chain. The reeve acted on behalf of the king or the halford, like a local official keeping things running smooth. Then we have the craftsmen, merchants and abbots. Craftsmen were skilled workers, blacksmiths, potters, weavers, who made tools, clothes and everyday goods. Merchants traded these goods, both locally and with folk from other kingdoms, or even across the sea. Abbots were the heads of monasteries. Though they were part of the church, their role was powerful in both spiritual and practical matters. They controlled land, wealth, and the monks under them, often holding as much influence as some nobles. Below the craftsmen and abbots we have the peasant farmers. These folk were tied to certain bits of farmland, and expected to work it in return for a place to live. Though the work were tough and the hours long, it gave them a steady source of income and food. They didn't have much freedom, but they weren't the lowest in society either. Some could even improve their standing over time. Below the peasant farmers we have the churls. These were free men, not tied to the land like others. They could own property, carry their own swords, and were often buried with them, showing their status. Compared to the strict class systems of the Romans, life for a churl were a lot more equal. They worked the land like other peasants, but with more rights and independence. A hard-working churl could even rise up the ranks if luck were on their side. However, many churls were poorer than peasant farmers who had steady work as they were tied to the land. So there was a balance of steady work or more freedom. Churls were free but could lack stability. At the very bottom, we have the slaves. These were people with no freedom, owned by others and forced to work without pay. They could be born into slavery, captured in war, or punished into it. Slaves worked in homes, on farms, or doing hard labour. They had no rights and couldn't own land or carry weapons. Some were treated harshly, while others might be trusted with important tasks, but they were still property. The Anglo-Saxons were more meritocratic than their German and continental counterparts. Land ownership weren't just tied to family or inheritance. A peasant, or even a slave, could work their way up the social ladder through hard work. If they met the legal criteria, they could even become thanes one day. But the ladder went both ways. Freemen sometimes sold themselves into slavery, kings could fall and become earls, and thanes could lose their land and drop to the rank of freemen. Status weren't fixed. It could rise or fall with fortune, law, or choice. They also create a variety of law codes. The formulation of legal codes, such as the laws of Ethelbert of Kent and the laws of Alfred the Great, represented early attempts at codifying legal principles and standards. The law of Ethelbert is the oldest set of surviving laws written by any Germanic peoples and was written in Old English. It was based on Christian principles and outlines that fines, known as Wehrgeld, would need to be paid to compensate any crimes. It gave the church special rights and outlined social hierarchies, such as marriage laws and dowries, and the legal status of children. It placed a larger emphasis on the importance of making oaths and keeping to them than today. Oaths were very important to the Anglo-Saxons. Other law codes have been lost to time, such as the law of Hengist and the laws of Iron. However, they were likely similar, with a mix of Germanic tradition and Roman Christian influences. The Anglo-Saxons had a unique and harsh system of justice, where punishments were often brutal and deeply rooted in their belief in divine intervention. The Wehrgeld was a system of paying folk back for crimes, while corporal punishment meant things like whipping or chopping bits off for smaller offences. The idea of Wehrgeld, where folk paid money instead of taking revenge after a killing, were a standout part of Anglo-Saxon law. It showed how they tried to sort things out and keep the peace. The price of Wehrgeld for different crimes changed a fair bit depending on the kingdom, but here's a rough example, one ChatGPT put together. Compurgation meant swearing an oath to prove your innocence, while outlawry cast folk out from the law entirely. Most times that ended in death. Swearing and holding to oaths were a big part of Anglo-Saxon law. Folks were trusted to keep their word, and breaking an oath weren't just illegal, it was seen as shameful and dishonourable. The court systems were right complicated. Tithings, groups of 10 households, looked out for each other and were held responsible for what one another did. Hundreds were bigger areas with their own local courts, and folkmoots were gatherings where the community came together to sort out disputes. Blood feuds were common, with families taking revenge for wrongs and keeping the violence going. If a Wehrgeld weren't paid, then blood feud killings could have been seen as legal, and sometimes even expected. Trial by combat were when two folk fought to prove who were in the right, believing God would see the just one through to victory. It weren't the most common way of settling things, but it did happen now and then, mainly when there weren't enough witnesses or oaths to clear someone. It were more usual among the nobility, who had the weapons, training and status to take part. Ordinary folk mostly stuck to oath swearing or other forms of trial, like trial by ordeal. Still, the idea behind it was strong. Folk believed God had guided the honest man's hand, so if you lost, folk reckoned you were guilty. End of. Trials by ordeal, like reaching into boiling water to fetch a stone, were meant to let God decide if someone were guilty or not. King Athelstan's laws laid out the rules for these ordeals, saying the wounds had to be checked 3 days later. If they were healing clean, that meant innocence. If not, guilty as charged. It weren't really an advancement by today's thinking, but back then it were a proper part of the law. Folk believed God wouldn't let the innocent suffer unfairly. Another common trial by ordeal were the hot iron, where the accused had to carry a red-hot iron bar in their bare hand for a set number of paces. After that, the hand were bandaged up, and 3 days later, it were unwrapped and checked. If the wound were clean and healing well, they were found innocent. But if it were infected or looking bad, they were judged guilty. The coronid were one of the more unusual trials by ordeal, meant mostly for clergy or folk of high rank. It involved eating a bit of blessed, but secretly cursed, bread and cheese. The belief were that if the person were guilty, God would make them choke, fall ill or show some other sign they'd done wrong. But if they swallowed it fine with no trouble, that were taken as proof of innocence. People did fail the coronid, though records are rare and patchy. The most famous tales about Godwin, Earl of Wessex. He were accused of lying to the king and took the coronid to clear his name, but as the story goes, he choked on the bread and dropped dead on the spot. Folk at the time saw that as God's judgment, plain and simple. And ducking, being tied up and dropped in water. They reckoned that holy water would reject the guilty, so if you floated, that meant you were in the wrong, but if you sank, you were seen as innocent, though of course that came with the risk of drowning before they pulled you back up. The blood eagle were a legendary punishment said to come from the Viking Age. It gets brought up often as one of the most brutal ways to die, though whether it ever really happened is still argued over. There's no solid proof it were used before the Viking raids, and even then, it might have been more myth than fact. The tale goes like this. First, the victim's back was sliced open right down the spine. Then the ribs were hacked away from the backbone and bent outwards to look like wings. After that, the lungs were dragged out and laid over the ribs, making a bloody shape like an eagle. It's a grim image, and some reckon it were more a bit of fearsome storytelling than actual practice, meant to scare enemies and glorify the saga heroes. Still, true or not, the idea of the blood eagles stuck in folks' minds as a symbol of Viking cruelty and power. Some historians think the story came from a bad translation of Old Norse poetry, and that it weren't a real punishment at all. The Anglo-Saxons also made many scientific advancements. The Anglo-Saxons made some astronomical observations, though not advanced by modern standards, which influenced their calendar and how they kept time. Monastic scriptoria were centres where monks worked to copy and preserve important manuscripts by hand. These quiet, dedicated spaces played a key role in keeping knowledge alive during times when books were rare and precious. Monks would spend hours copying religious texts, classical works, and historical records, often adding careful illustrations and notes in the margins. Thanks to their efforts, many writings from earlier centuries survived, including parts of the Bible, ancient philosophy, and early records of English history. The Anglo-Saxons were truly experts in record keeping, and we owe a great deal to them in modern times. They also used standardized weights and measures in trade, which helped make sure deals were fair and consistent. This system allowed folk to buy and sell with a bit more trust, knowing that a pound of grain or a yard of cloth meant the same across different markets. It showed a practical approach to business and helped build a sense of order in everyday life. The Anglo-Saxon laid the groundwork for the modern imperial system. They used units like the pound, yard and gallon, although not exactly as we know them today. Some Anglo-Saxon trading hubs had designated marketplaces, where goods were bought and sold using standardized weights and measures. These early efforts at regulation marked the beginnings of a more organized system of trade, creating a sense of fairness and trust among merchants and buyers. By setting clear rules and expectations, these marketplaces helped reduce disputes and encourage trade between different regions. They also allowed local authorities to monitor commerce more easily, sometimes collecting taxes or tolls in the process. Over time, this system helped shape the structure of medieval economies, and laid the foundation for later trade laws and measurement standards. The Anglo-Saxons was also where English as an ethnicity came from. It were Bede who first put across the idea of the English people. In 732 he wrote his History of the English Church and People, where he talked about the folk in lowland Britain, whether they were Saxons, Jutes or Angles, as one English nation. He traced the name back to a tale from the 1990s. The tale went that Pope Gregory the Great saw some beautiful blue-eyed, fair-haired and fair-skinned slaves in a market over in Italy, and was told they were Angles. Not Angles, but angels, he said. It were a pun, and it sparked an idea, one you can feel in Bede, that the English were a chosen race. This were the first time the English ethnicity ever got mentioned in history. Pope Gregory I would later send Augustine of Canterbury to bring Christianity to these new English folk. This tale were once a key part of the English national story, though it's been slowly forgotten. It was something every English child got taught back in the day, but the education system's gone downhill since. It's worth noting that in this first telling of the English people, they were slaves. And that's something the English had to fight against for nearly all our history, another thing the modern education system fails to teach. England was formed before it was formed. It sounds odd, but through the writings and history of the Anglo-Saxons, like Bede's, we can see they were more connected than just a bunch of petty kingdoms. It came together loosely through politics and shared culture, before folk like Alfred the Great could start to pull the idea of a united England into shape. An idea that were made real by Alfred's grandson. You can see this clear as day in the old idea of a Brett Walder, for example. If you take out away from this video, let it be this. We the English have always looked back to an idea of Englishness. Even before 1066, where many wrongly reckon our history starts, our English ancestors were already shaping the land and the culture of these islands. This sense of Englishness should never be forgotten. Our language, our island, our imaginations, our literature, religion and songs, all of it finds its roots in Anglo-Saxon England. This is also how we're seen by the outside world. A good recent example of this is the Russian leader, Putin, who said that the Anglo-Saxons are to blame for the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline in the Atlantic Sea. He were talking not just about England, but about places like the USA, Canada, and the UK as a whole, because the rest of the world seems to understand we're one people better than we do ourselves. You can see this too in what other nations call us in their own tongues. You'll have to mind my pronunciation though, as I have a mild black country dialect. In French, England is called Angleterre, which means land of the Angles. In Scottish Gaelic, the word for England is Sasine, which comes from the word Saxons. In Latin and Greek, the word for England is Anglia, derived from Angli, the Latin name for the Angles. In Italian and Spanish, the word for England is Inghilterra, meaning land of the Angles, with terra meaning land, and Ingle referring to the Angles or English. In Arabic, the word for England is Inglitra, which comes from the Latin Anglia, meaning the Angles. And finally, in Russian, the word for England is Anglia, once again a reference to the Angles. This demonstrates that England is globally recognised as the homeland of the Anglo-Saxons or English, with the name itself rooted in the identity of the English. It serves as a clear example of a nation named after and for an ethnic group. But where did the term Anglo-Saxon come from? Well, the term were first used to describe the many Germanic folk arriving in Britannia, though it wouldn't have been a proper collective term back then. Bede, for example, used the terms Anglorum and Saxonum. Anglorum or Anglicus were just one of many umbrella terms used at the time to talk about who we now call the Anglo-Saxons, to set them apart from the Celtic Britons. Plenty of folk wrongly reckon the term were made up in the 18th or 19th century, and that it were never used in its own time. That's a straight up lie. The term Anglo-Saxon were also used outright, same as we use it today. Some clear-cut examples of this are, during King Edwig's reign in 956, there's the Latin abbreviation Anglo-Su, which stands for Anglo-Saxonum. The OU were a commonly used Latin abbreviation for Anglo-Saxonum, and that's the Latin word for Anglo-Saxon. Here it's used in a charter, an official royal document granting land or rights to a church or noble. The one from 956 showed not just political stuff, but also how folk at the time used terms like Anglo-Su. This is a good example because here it's used in the context of as an ethnic group. Alfred the Great used the title Rex Saxonum when he were King of Wessex, meaning King of the Saxons. But after he took London in 886, his title changed to Rex Anglo-Saxonum, meaning King of the Anglo-Saxons United. Edward the Elder also used the same Rex Anglo-Saxonum title. Then Aethelstan, after uniting all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, used Rex Anglorum, meaning King of the English. That title were only used by kings who ruled over a fully united England. This shows a clear progression in how power and identity were expressed. The shift in titles from Rex Saxonum to Rex Anglo-Saxonum and then to Rex Anglorum demonstrates how the idea of a unified Anglo-Saxon people, and later a single English kingdom, developed over time. It proves that these terms weren't just poetic or symbolic. They were used in real political contexts to reflect changing ideas of unity, ethnicity, and rulership. It also proves up that Anglo-Saxon weren't some modern invention, it were a recognised and official term used by kings themselves. This was now most likely used to tell the Anglo-Saxons apart from the Viking newcomers, who were themselves also Germanic. Angles, Saxons and English all meant different things at this point. Saxons meant folk from round Wessex, Angles meant folk from round Mercia, Anglo-Saxons meant Wessex and Mercia joined up. English meant all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms together. Over time, from the Norman invasion, the English language changed, and by the 1500s, English had taken over from the older term Anglos and other versions. Though other nations still called the English Anglish or Saxon, this change only happened in the English language. Angles, Saxons and English were by this point all just different words for the same thing. From around the 1900s, the term Anglo-Saxon started being used just for the original English settlers, more as an academic and historical term, even though the Anglo-Saxons and the English were basically the same folk. By this point, the term, though standardised, had taken on less of an ethnic meaning and more of a historical and cultural one, to mark the difference between the original and modern English people. Around the same time, British folk started settling all over the world, but there was no British passport or set nationality. Everyone were just seen as equal British subjects of the Crown. So the use of Anglo-Saxon, or the still commonly used Anglos, came to mean the English migrants and settlers from Britain who went to places like the USA and Australia, more as an ethnic or racial identity. This shift happened due to a growing racial view of the world, and some uses of the term from that time would now be seen as racist. Some folk still hold on to that, thinking themselves a superior people, but they're a minority. Just because you use a term don't mean you're endorsing every way it's ever been used. So the man on the street would have still used the term in a racial sense, while the academics were using it more as a historical one. Anglo-Saxon is, in the modern day, used both as a historical term for the first English settlers and as an ethnonym, much like how the word Arab is used. For example, the term Anglo-Saxon model doesn't just mean the economic model of England, but includes the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK and Ireland. It shows a mix of an academic jargon and ethnonym rolled into one. That's why the term Anglo-Saxon or Anglo can be mistaken as racist, and why some folk are trying to rename or even get rid of the academic use of the term Anglo-Saxon when talking about the early English settlers. This isn't helped by how differently the terms are used in Britain itself compared to places like America or Australia. In Britain, Anglo-Saxon is seen as a useful historical term, and also as a sort of ethnic one. But abroad, where folk don't get taught much about the Anglo-Saxons in a historical sense, it's more often taken as a racial term. A lot of the people who've got a problem with the term Anglo-Saxon tend to be very anti-English or against the British Empire, and look at it through more of an identity politics lens, more so than with any real local arguments. To make things even more muddled, plenty of English folk are now starting to call themselves Anglo or Anglo-Saxon again online, especially in places like the USA and Australia, as a way to hold on to their English heritage. So just like I might call myself British English, meaning I'm loyal to the UK but racially English, others might say Anglo-Canadian, meaning they're loyal to Canada, but racially English since the word English often brings to mind the nation of England, not the ethnic group. To make things extra complicated, English people in England are also reusing the term to hold on to their indigenous status to England due to mass migration, where many random people around the world are calling themselves English without any real ties to the land. People all around the world use ethnonyms to link themselves to their ancestors. There's nothing strange about that. For example, many Chinese still call themselves Huns, and plenty of South Africans still call themselves Zulu. The term Anglo-Saxon could be used as an ethnonym for folk with British ancestry, since English, Irish, Scottish and Welsh people all carry a mix of Anglo-Saxon and Celtic British DNA due to generations of interbreeding. Still, I reckon a new term like Anglo-Briton or Anglo-Celtic might work better as an ethnonym. That said, most folk already know what Anglo-Saxon means, and it's usually only the condescending sort who like to nitpick the term anyway, so they can just be ignored. Although the Germanic tribes only conquered the southern part of Great Britain, all of the British Isles, including Ireland, Wales and Scotland, carry some degree of Germanic DNA. In fact, Scotland has more Norwegian ancestry than England. However, as expected, England itself has significantly more Saxon DNA. with the average person having between 10% and 40% Saxon heritage. Green represents the native Briton population. This group was highly diverse, with no unified genetic or cultural identity. There is no such thing as a single Celtic or Common Briton DNA type. This group is best understood as a mix of various ancient peoples who lived on the islands. Gold signifies Anglo-Saxon DNA. This ancestry comes from the migration and settlement of people from northern Germany and Denmark during the Anglo-Saxon period. Brown shows the genetic influence of other Central European and Gaulish populations. These include groups that arrived later, such as the Normans following the conquest in 1066. Blue indicates Scandinavian Germanic ancestry. This comes mainly from Viking settlers who arrived in waves during the early Middle Ages. Red reflects Iberian ancestry, likely introduced through ancient trade routes or earlier waves of migration from the Iberian Peninsula. Pink marks other more recent sources of genetic input. These are expected to increase due to modern immigration that began in large numbers during the 1960s. Overall, the differences in DNA across the British Isles are relatively minor. Over time, the population has become a cultural and genetic blend, a true melting pot of Anglo-Saxon and Briton heritage. I will explore the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in more detail in a future video. However, this modern genetic mixture is just the latest chapter in a much older story. Thousands of years ago, the Beaker culture from the Lower Rhine region mixed with the corded Ware culture. The people who emerged from this blending spread across northwestern Europe and became the ancestors of nearly all the ethnic groups discussed here. The Britons, Celts, Angles, Jutes, Saxons, Danes, Norse, and Huguenots. All the peoples who migrated to and settled in the British Isles can ultimately trace their roots back to this same origin, the Beaker culture in the Lower Rhine. The only significant exception was the Romans, who did not come from this group and never settled in large enough numbers to make a lasting genetic impact. So what does this mean? The long-standing arguments about who was more native, the Anglo-Saxons or the Britons, are largely irrelevant. Genetically, they are cousins. The difference in DNA between Anglo-Saxons and Danes, or Vikings, is even smaller, to the point of being nearly insignificant. This also means that people in England and the wider British Isles can legitimately identify as Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and Indigenous Britons, all at the same time. In fact, the indigenous British people may have a stronger claim to being native than many modern groups often described that way, such as the Turks or even some Native American tribes. If someone has at least 51% British DNA, whether Anglo-Saxon, Ancient Briton, or both, then they can rightfully consider themselves indigenous to the British Isles, regardless of where they were born. The modern British population descends from a mix of native Britons and Scandinavian Germanic settlers. When these groups came together, they had to decide which language their children would speak. They chose a Germanic language. This choice began the process of ethnogenesis, the birth of a new ethnic identity. That identity became known as Anglo-Saxon, a culture centred on Germanic heritage, leadership, gods and storytelling, yet still shaped by the traditions of the Britons and the landscape of Britannia. Language was a key indicator of ethnicity in early England. In a society where legal rights, acceptance in one's kin group, access to power, and even the right to bear arms were reserved for those claiming Germanic descent, speaking Old English without Latin or Brittonic influence was extremely valuable. As Old English became the dominant and most prestigious language in certain areas, speakers of other languages, such as British Celtic or Latin, had an incentive to learn it. Over several generations, many families stopped speaking their original languages entirely, blending further into the emerging Anglo-Saxon identity. However, some over-educated pseudo-intellectuals are now trying to argue against the term Anglo-Saxon, dragging it down to claims of racism and nationalism. It was true that the Anglo-Saxons were an ethnic group, and that many folk proud of England were also interested in them, but I don't see that as a bad thing. History had always been a way to look into one's own ancestors and a nation's past, and that's why so many were drawn to it in the first place. Patriotism and heritage are also a great way to get folks into history from a young age, especially lads. For the same reasons people love supporting their local football teams. This trend of getting rid of the terms like Anglo-Saxon is called decolonising the curriculum, and it came from American academics who'd been educated past their own cognitive abilities. Some of them just not liking England full stop, what we used to call traitors. It had since made its way over to the UK from the States, and started gaining ground around 2019. In 2024, Cambridge, York and Nottingham were rewriting history to try and deny the very existence of the Anglo-Saxons, proving that universities had become a joke and aren't fit for purpose. They also let outright Marxists indoctrinate students, like Dr. Eric Wade, a lead voice in the so-called decolonisation of the curriculum, and Mary Ramburn-Ulm, a clear racist and race hustler. You could see just how off their heads and indoctrinated these folk are just by reading their ex-profiles. There were also folk like Susan Oosthuizen, who wrote revisionist books like The Emergence of the English, where she claimed there were too few archaeological finds to prove the Anglo-Saxons existed, while completely ignoring DNA evidence. To her, it might as well not exist at all. Susan brushed off Anglo-Saxon culture as just a regional twist on continental Europe, denying any real Germanic influence. She ignored the fact that Germanic tribes were in Rome, and that Anglo-Saxon culture were a blend of Romanized Celtic and Germanic roots. She also claimed the Anglo-Saxon migration were more multicultural, a theory DNA evidence had already disproved, showing her bias plain as day. Others argue that the term should be banned altogether, one such person being Dr. Mary Ramburn-Ulm. They argue the word Anglo-Saxon is too exclusionary, too racist, and that Anglo-Saxon studies were too white. This is, of course, ridiculous, but some folks still fell for it. For example, the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists ended up changing their name to the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. Mary Ramburn-Ulm had infiltrated and subverted the group from the inside, a common trick used by history revisionists and Marxists. She is also what you'd call a race grifter, someone who made money, duped folk, and saw the world through a racial lens without realising they were the racist in the room. Some, like Jack Durand, didn't deny the evidence, but argue that the term excluded people. But I don't see how. You don't need to be an Anglo-Saxon to enjoy learning about English history and culture. For example, Arab is also an exclusive term by definition, yet you don't need to be ethnically Arab to take an interest in Arab history or culture. In a multicultural society, I'd say it were even more important to hold on to Anglo-Saxon as a term, to help folk integrate and get to grips with the nation they live in now. But yeah, the people most interested in English history are always going to be the English. I'm not sure why that surprises anyone. Who do you reckon's most interested in Han Chinese history? So why is the historic distinction useful? I like the difference between Anglo-Saxon and English when talking about history, because it is more descriptive. Even if it meant roughly the same thing, we know that if I said Anglo-Saxon monarchs, I am talking about kings like Alfred the Great. But if I said English monarchs, I mean kings like Henry VIII. More historically descriptive equals better. That said, I see no reason why the term can't also be used as an ethnonym, since it pretty much means the same as English anyway. However, the Anglo-Saxon world has survived much greater threats than pseudo-intellectuals and race grifters. Lindisfarne is a small island off the coast of Northumbria. A monastery was built there and lived in by monks. It came to be known as the Holy Island. Meanwhile, Viking raids were getting bigger and reaching further, mainly because of their constant upgrades to longships and their growing knowledge of the riches to be had overseas. The raid on Lindisfarne happened in 793 AD, most likely carried out by Norsemen. It weren't the first Viking attack, but hitting such a sacred place sent shockwaves through all of Christendom. That's why it's often marked as the start of the Viking Age. We'll be going into that period in the next British history video. Thanks for watching, hope you liked it. There is another video about the settlement of England and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that I'm sure you will enjoy. I hope to see you next time. All the references I used are in the description along with the music links. The music used is by David Chaz, Grendel Sin and Sarah Louise Tilsley, so a big thank you to them.